Thank you very much. Jó estét kívánok. Hello, everyone. So my name, as Sophie said, is Calum Nicholson. I'm Director of Research at the Danube Institute. And I should just say some words first about the Danube Institute before I talk about this event. So the Danube Institute is a think tank in Budapest. It's been there about 13 years. And in the last 5 years, we've grown quite a lot. And our purpose is really to try and establish Hungary's voice in international discourses around geopolitical issues and cultural issues too, quite a broad set of interests, but also to try and explain the Hungarian frame of reference, be it historical or cultural, for the outside world as well. And to do that, we do quite a lot of things. We have events that happen about once a week in Budapest, as well as doing events around the world, such as this here, but also in DC and other places in London. And increasingly we're working in the Turkic world as well. We do a lot of audio and video casts, or podcasts and video casts. You can find us on Spotify. We have Danube Culture, Danube Politics, and Danube Knowledge. Danube Knowledge is taking some of our research papers and doing sort of audio essays about them. I think they're very well produced. I think they're actually good stories. We had a very good one recently on the big Hungarian festival Tusványos, which happens in Romania every summer, and the origins of it and how it came into being post-communism after Ceausescu was killed, and his origins are fascinating. Tusványos has had a real impact, I think, on democratic culture in that region in the last few decades, particularly among the Hungarians. And so we did a paper on that and a podcast on that. We also have a fellowship program where we have about, at the moment, we have about 30-odd fellows at Danube, and some are Hungarian fellows, and many of them are from all over the world, America, the United Kingdom. Really, we've had most continents now represented at the Danube Institute, and they take part in our events. They write papers, and that's the final thing we do, is we do these papers. And we do a paper at the rate of about one a week on a range of different topics. And we're here today to present one of our papers written by what used to be, we describe him in the Institute as our super intern, which is Max Keating here. Max is Irish, and he came to us last summer for a few months with an interest in cultural diplomacy. And very quickly, with almost no guidance or prompting, he set off to interview everyone he could in Budapest on the issue of cultural diplomacy, and wrote up what is, I think, one of the best papers we have. Also has a very beautiful cover, which I really like. But it's a really interesting paper, and he's going to talk about that today, because the Hungarian approach to cultural diplomacy has some interesting features which are almost unique to it, but are certainly things which and features which other nations might learn from as well. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Max to talk for about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. I'm sure I'll have a few for him, but start thinking of your questions as well if you have anything. It should be a pretty open discussion after that. But thank you very much for joining this evening, and Max, take it away.
Hello everyone, my name is Max, and today I'm just going to be presenting my research paper to all of you. And to kind of begin with, I'd like to talk about, just in general, the importance of soft power and cultural diplomacy in a globalized world. So soft power as a concept in contemporary international relations literature begins with the writings of Joseph Nye, former official in the US State Department, in which he discusses the changes that the mass media ecosystem has introduced to the way nations communicate with one another. Specifically here, he introduces the ideas of public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy as two separate yet related concepts. Specifically, cultural diplomacy is kind of seen as relying on slow media or the high arts such as books, literature, whereas public diplomacy is reliant on modern technology such as radio and film, and today we would say things like the internet and social media. But the reason why I've chosen in this paper to focus on cultural diplomacy specifically is because I think that at the very core of what is being communicated here in a public diplomacy setting is ultimately cultural. It is the unique things that separate and indeed also unite different countries based on their heritage. And this comes into the concept of nation branding and its importance, particularly for smaller countries who don't have the same economic or military might to define themselves on the world stage, and as such, in the spirit of cooperation, seek other realms of developing their diplomatic relationships. And one of those examples, I would argue, is the subject of cultural diplomacy in general, and it has become a very popular tool, particularly in the early 21st century, with theorists such as Alexander Wendt, a social constructivist, arguing that the more that these cultural topics are integrated into modern diplomacy, the more actors on the world stage begin to calculate the responses of their neighbours with greater accuracy. I would then move towards why I think Hungary is such an interesting example of this, is that one of Simon Anhalt's primary critiques of the way that modern nation branding is conducted is the lack of coordination that is typically found between the civil society architecture, the tourism sectors, business, and even government ministry activities. That, for the most part, in most countries, these things are left separate, particularly when it comes to civil society organizations, which oftentimes have differing priorities and different focuses, but this can lead to mixed signaling, mixed, indeed, the general divide in the focuses that each organization would have with regards to different countries, but also to points of culture that they would focus on. And so that's why I think Hungary is such a fascinating example of this, because it is one of these cases where you see the ecosystem between the domestic cultural policy, the education sector or the research sector in Hungary, as well as its international cultural activities, really be melded together in ways that are quite impressive. And I think to first start this is to really discuss how Hungary really got to this focus on domestic cultural policy. And this really is coming out of the idea that in order to have an appealing culture for you to broadcast on the world stage, in a world of globalized, commodified cultures where it is difficult to differentiate your message from others, is to demonstrate through your own domestic policies, the domestic vigor of your own practices, that your culture is indeed something that is broadcastable in a unique manner. Now, Hungary comes to this reliance on domestic cultural policy largely as a result of the Minister of Education, Count Kuno Klebelsberg, from 1922 to 1931, who was involved with the creation of the first Collegium Hungaricum and kind of setting the path forward for Hungarian diplomacy post-Trianon, in the sense that Hungary had not only been diplomatically isolated in this period, it also required major education reforms, as historic universities in cities such as Bratislava required relocation alongside the support of the Hungarian diaspora communities in these now neighbouring regions. So that's kind of a quick summary of it that we can go into later with more discussion. But I think to really look at the demonstrable data that we have does indicate that Hungarian domestic cultural policy has become an increasingly important focus for the country, particularly with government expenditure on cultural programs at the, in 2014, going from 281,000 million forints to 741,000 million forints in 2023 is a demonstration that this is something that is more than doubled. It is becoming or has been a greater priority for the country. And similarly, the number of books published by Hungarian authors since 2001 to 2024, going from 8,800 roughly to 14,300 roughly, which does demonstrate a stronger domestic readership base, that there is investment in this area. And furthermore, I would add that the educational exchange element here. So it's not just that you need to have a very reliable domestic cultural base, but also having educational institutions which attract people from other countries as well. And I think that the best way to demonstrate this is looking at the number of foreign students enrolled in Hungarian universities, again increasing from roughly 25,000 in 2014 to 43,000 in 2023. So it is a large increase, and I would even add to that the impressive nature of this increase also includes the fact that it is not just coming solely from neighbouring European countries, but also through the Stipendium Hungaricum scholarship. It is drawing more attention from countries in Africa and Asia, demonstrating that Hungarian cultural diplomacy is not just a tool used in its neighbourhood, but also internationally. And that is where we come into the activities of the Liszt Institute, developing from 2 Collegium Hungaricum in 1924 to today having 24 locations, or rather being present in 24 different countries across the world, including in China, Russia, Japan, and South Korea. So this isn't just that you have a base in Central Europe and Western Europe and the United States, but that there is a Hungarian cultural presence in all of these important countries. And so I would say really what is interesting about this and why I think it is valuable for other countries to consider it. I know I've kind of glossed through it quite quickly, but I think it's important because most countries suffer from what Simon Anholt in his book, Competitive Identity, the New Brand Management for Nations, discusses, is this element of neglect. It's not just the lack of coordination between entities and organizations, but it is also, in some ways, not using the tools that are in its arsenal. So I think a good example of this is that for most European countries, there is some kind of unique instrument or sport. I think, being Irish, Ireland does have a great priority on this with the uilleann pipes, the harp, and the Gaelic Athletic Association. But other countries, typically, you don't see these tools being used effectively, in the sense that, when you see these things, they are identifiably Irish, but it seems that, popular sports like football kind of tend to overpower the cultural uniqueness that other countries do have. I think Hungary is kind of similar to Ireland in this regard, because in a lot of these kind of international engagement events, particularly things like Tusványos and MCC Fest, the presence of folk music is almost unavoidable. Even at a kind of more serious geopolitical discussions like the Budapest Global Dialogue, there is always a Hungarian cultural presence. And I think this is kind of demonstrating the focus on communicating the identity of a country and its practices in a way that it isn't just for, the Hungarians that are in attendance, but demonstrating the country that you are visiting to foreign guests. And I think that's why Tuscany is probably one of the most important models that Hungary gives to the rest of Europe, in that you have this unique opportunity through not just the focus on the Hungarian minority in Transylvania, but also bringing in NGOs, small businesses, tourism agencies, and research institutions like MCC or the Danube Institute into one setting where, while it may have in origin been very focused on the Hungarian minority in that region, has also drawn international attention and international guests, in the sense that it operates as kind of a window into the contemporary life of the country in almost all elements that it can be seen. So I think that is kind of a sufficient overview of the paper and kind of the ideas behind it, and I think then we'll do some questions.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Max. So, thank you very much. So, when you were talking, actually, it made me think of a couple of years ago. As part of the Danube Institute, I went to Iraq, and I was in a rural part of Iraq, in a remote village or small town, actually name dropped in the Bible, Al-Kosh, and it's a Christian village. And no one there spoke English, and I was trying to Google Translate because they have better 5G in Iraq than, say, London, actually. And I was there, and I was Google Translating, and they told me there was one local guy who spoke English. And so I met him, and I was speaking to him, and I said, "How did you learn English so well?" He said, "Oh, I learned it in a small town in a country called Hungary that you'll never have heard of, a town called Nyíregyháza." I said, "Oh, Jónapot kívánok." He said, "Jónapot kívánok." And so a Budapest-based Scot meets an Iraqi Christian in Al-Kosh, and they greet each other in Hungarian. And I thought that's a good sign of Hungarian cultural outreach. Okay, so first of all, Max, so the context for you, you're an intern with us, but you are also a student where?
At University College Dublin. So I'm currently doing my bachelor's degree in history and politics.
Yeah.
And at the moment I'm writing my dissertation on the subject of the historical origins of Irish cultural diplomacy, particularly with the use of folklore as a tool with international engagement in the 1920s and 30s.
So what drives your interest in this topic? I mean, it's an interesting topic, cultural diplomacy, and it's because sometimes I think people think about, we live in an age increasingly of, hard power, where we're seeing this re-emerging global order where everyone's talking about the importance of just pure strength is strength.
Yeah.
And yet here we are talking about cultural diplomacy, and certainly, I think in Hungary you see a lot of effort, as you've demonstrated, into cultural diplomacy in recent years. I have two questions really on this. Why are you interested in it, and why are they interested in it?
It's a good start. Well, I think I'm interested in it fundamentally because I think that it's a very interesting topic. I enjoy the study of folklore. I read quite a lot into Irish subjects on it, but I do try to look elsewhere, and I do find these connections in how they are broadcast by different countries to be very interesting. I think the reason why people are interested in it is that it communicates an element of authenticity to the way that a country presents itself, and that it's not just some kind of sterilized image that's being put forward in a boardroom or a negotiation meeting, but that you're actually talking to a country and not a company in that sense.
So, and what about the Hungarian interest in this? Because obviously there's been, how many Liszt Institutes do you say there were?
Pardon?
These institutes here, how many?
There are
24?
26 in 24 different countries, if I remember correctly.
And what is that proportionate to other countries, other small countries of a similar size? So I'm not talking about, the context here, there's a distinction, it seems to me. You have cultures that have massive sort of international cultural capital, like the UK, we have the Queen, or we had the Queen, sorry, and we have a king, and we have tea, and all these other things that everyone likes to associate with Britain. You go through the British airport, it's Paddington Bear, it's all these things we associate with Britain. And I guess with smaller countries like Hungary, it's not, unless you've been there, maybe people think of wine or a couple of spirits like palinka and maybe 1950s football, but I think maybe 2030s football, who knows. But relative to other nations of a similar scale, what is Hungary doing culturally? Do they have more institutional presence like that than, say, I don't know, the Bulgarians or something, or something else?
I would say that given the challenges that Hungary has had to go through, really, particularly with the language being so different and the culture being so unique, seeing that being used as actually a tool for something positive is why Hungary has been much more successful relative to its peers. Because when it comes to the education of foreign languages, and you have the custodians of the French, Spanish, and German languages, Alliance Française, Institut of Cervantes, Goethe Institute, and they do a lot of very good work in educating people on languages and instructing them. But I think in that focus as an educational institution, they kind of lose the focus on culture and the focus on music, and kind of giving people that glimpse into what the country is like, what the people think.
Sure.
And so I would say it is specific, like to kind of wheel it back into the history of it and why it's successful, is that in the 20th century, Hungary experienced two serious moments of diplomatic isolation. First is after the First World War and kind of rebuilding after Trianon, and that's when, under Klebelsberg, this kind of system of domestic cultural policy and then kind of bringing it abroad is gestated. And then under the communist regime as well, where these cultural connections were heavily restricted and they were controlled, and so you only see today, post 1989, post Cold War, that Hungary has been able to actually grow and bring Hungarian culture to the world stage properly.
Yeah. Obviously, all nations these days have large diasporas. People often think of the UK, of a lot of, I'm British, there's a lot of immigration to the UK, but there's a vast proportion of Brits who are actually abroad. And actually, same with Hungary, a lot of Hungarians in the neighboring countries for historical reasons, but also, I was just in Zurich the last few days, and I took 3 taxis, and I went to one restaurant, and the waiter was Hungarian, and 2 of the 3 taxi drivers were Hungarian. There's a huge number of Hungarians there. And so to what extent what's the connection between cultural diplomacy and diaspora? And what is the meaning of cultural diplomacy within the diasporic communities?
I think it's used as a positive tool in different cases. To kind of start with, on the Irish example I'm more familiar with, is that our cultural diplomacy with the United States and Australia hinges on the interpersonal relationships between Irish people at home, the Irish diaspora abroad, and the kind of sentimentality that they have. And I think it's the same thing with these autochthonous Hungarian communities in the border regions, where they speak the Hungarian language, or in some cases they need to have greater support from the Hungarian government to preserve their Hungarian identity. And that itself, I think, it's a promise. It's that this is a country with a strong domestic cultural life, and in order to have a successful international broadcast of your culture, it has to begin at home. And I think that focus on the Hungarian minority communities in neighbouring countries is probably partly due. It's partly a factor to the success that Hungary has seen.
So I have a question for you, actually. I've always wanted to ask someone this, actually. Is that as a Brit, and I lived in Canada a bit as a kid, I've always noticed how Americans are very, very proud of finding any Irish connection. And there's, I think Biden was Irish. Obama was always joking, it was Obama, he's one of the Obamas. And it's but Americans have always had this passion or this love for Ireland, and every politician likes to reference it. They like to American politicians like to reference the blue collar roots, and that when you roll up your sleeves and do some real work. But also they always mention being Irish in some way, or trying to find a connection. So, why is that? How has Ireland been so successful at that? Is it a conscious effort of cultural diplomacy in some way to get the Americans thinking this way, or is it just something that's happened? Why? I mean, no one does that about the English. There's no American saying, "Well, actually, I'm English."
Yeah, I think it's certainly more passive in Ireland's scenario, and I think like the good example of just how passive it is that just owing to our history, we don't really advertise the shamrock or the harp as symbols very strongly on our products abroad, but those two symbols are universally identifiable as Irish. And the fact that you can bring that to someone and you can say, "Oh, that's from Ireland. It must be because of the symbol." I think that is fundamentally why. It's the kind of implicit element of the nation branding that we have, and carrying that to the United States, particularly with religious differences, Irish Catholics in America, and maintaining their identity much in kind of stronger ways than other Americans would have.
Okay. By the way, if anyone's got any questions, put your hand up and I'll catch them. I've got a few myself, but. So with the Hungarian cultural diplomacy and the approach they've had, and I think what you've described as an integrated model, like you were saying, there's different, even in relation to the state, there are different institutions. There's the Liszt Institutes, there are various educational institutes, these scholarships and so on. If I understand you correctly, you're saying there is a kind of coordinated strategy to that. Is that correct? And you said something about, we were talking earlier, you said an integration of the international policy and domestic policy, is that right?
Yeah, and so that's what I'm talking about here when I mean that in order to have a strong international cultural image that you project outward, you need to actually have something tangible and vigorous at home. Otherwise it would be quite hollow to advertise something, and it wouldn't really come across as authentic, which is really, I think, the end goal of cultural and public diplomacy, is that you are making person-to-person contacts, and that isn't just a one-way street. In Joseph Nye's book, he argues explicitly that it is both ways. That by communicating your identity to another culture, that vice versa will also take place.
Sure.
Yeah.
So how are they actually how are the Hungarians doing this relative to other equivalent sort of size nations? What is 9.5 million Hungarians? So how's that actually going as a strategy? This sort of integrated strategy. Are there other nations doing similar things?
I don't believe so. I think particularly it is the coordination of it that is unique in Europe. Just how when you have an ecosystem that not only appeals to Hungarians inside of Hungary, but Hungarians outside of the state's borders, and to foreign nationals who are interested in any element of Hungarian life. I think that is something unique that other countries haven't yet done. And even further, the kind of ability for Hungary to broadcast different elements of its culture to different types of countries, and particularly you see this with the Turkic World and the Kurultai Sporting Festival. And these kind of strengths to kind of demonstrate that Hungary is using its strengths and taking advantage of these elements of its history, the customs that it practices. Whereas I think that the real kind of problem with most other countries that practice these things is that they don't really go the full way. Cultural diplomacy is quite important for most European countries, and they do engage in it, but it's generally the case that it's an afterthought rather than a priority. And I think in Hungary's case, given the shock of being cut off from the world, it really does kind of encourage that motivation to demonstrate, that Hungary has this role that is played in both the European culture and in its Turkic roots.
Kind of, we're here and we're relevant. So, okay, I have a question for you on this. So there's kind of a paradox with everything we're talking about, is that typically you think of international diplomacy as often about language tuition, like the, is it the Alliance Française? Is that the
that's...
or the British Council? And then also sport, was it Gaelic football? And or if you're Scottish, Scottish country games, tossing the caber, this sort of thing. But Hungary doesn't have any distinctive sport, I don't think. and the language is I've been trying to learn it. It's a fiendishly difficult language. So given they don't have these two elements, how are they managing to? Well, how do you overcome that? How have they overcome not having those two distinctive things?
Well, I think
As
with
part of
regards
the
to like with regards to the sports subject matter, I think that it is like the Kurultai, these nomadic step games like horseback riding and archery are. I'm not sure the extent to which they would have been Hungarian national sports. From what it seems, it is more of a subculture in Hungary, but it is something that has been leveraged to bring more interest to Hungary from the Turkic world. And Hungary's participation as an observer state on the Turkic Council kind of facilitates that. So you can see this synergy between the state's foreign policy aims and the cultural public bases that are taking place. And then on the subject of language, I think that it's probably a strength that Hungary doesn't have to educate people on the language in the way that other countries do. Because if you think about it, learning Spanish or German from any of these cultural institutes, it becomes an academic exercise. The people that are attracted to it are, for the most part, probably in education of some form, and they're ultimately not there to experience or learn the culture. And so in some ways, that prioritization of language education, it may be a distraction. And for Hungary, given just how different its language is from its neighbours, and Hungary does provide instruction for like the Hungarian diaspora and Hungarian minorities in the language. So it is more so targeting and bringing your cultural heritage and the specific parts of it to the places where it is actually going to be appreciated.
Yeah. So if anyone's got any questions, do put your hand up and I'll try and see it. And but I just have one more first, which is well, I have a couple more actually for you, but we can weave them in. But one is, like you mentioned at the beginning, you mentioned this theorist who's written about this Wendt, I think his name is. Wendt?
Alexander Wendt.
Yeah, W-N-D-T.
Yeah.
Okay. Wendt, yeah. And so, and he said that he thought that cultural diplomacy matters because if a nation, to keep the international system stable, it helps a nation to know the nature of another culture, in a sense. Can you just talk a bit more about that? I mean, really, what is the goal of cultural diplomacy? What is in the ideal world, what would be a successful cultural diplomacy result?
Yeah, I'll just read the exact quote here as well, where he says that the more that culture matters in international politics, the more stable the international system becomes. And according to Wendt, culture matters insofar as it affects the calculations of actors. I think that is kind of important to recognize, is that contrary to this very rigid realist view of international relations, that neighborly relations are important, and understanding that you have some kind of common heritage and thread that connects you to different countries across the world is important, and it does lead to, I think, better relations, better practice in negotiations in such a way that it can only be good.
Yeah, I suppose it's not that different from any sort of neighbor, because sometimes you ever see people have neighbor disputes just in our own lives. Often people will have if they have a neighbor, they'll say to them, the law says you're not allowed to cut that tree, and they approach it in a very legalistic manner, saying you do not have that right. But actually, if you just met with the person, had a coffee, and you can actually de-escalate things. And I suppose is cultural diplomacy the equivalent for nations as to just having a drink with your neighbor? Is that essentially the point?
Yeah, and a neighbor, even if they're on another continent, it's all about finding these points of historical overlap. I think with Ireland, if you're coming from an Irish perspective, you bring out the connections between Ireland and Hungary, like the Resurrection of Hungary that Arthur Griffith wrote, and there's all of these things, and there's always something that can connect you in some way, as like whether you're Irish or from wherever you are to another country or another region.
Yeah. I just, as a total aside on this, I live in Budapest, and my background's Scottish. I don't sound it, but and Hungary is full of like Scottish connections. The bridge there, the Széchenyi Bridge, is built by a Scot. And actually tomorrow, a couple months ago, I met a Hungarian who invited me. They were doing a Burn supper, a Scottish country dance. So they invited me to cut the haggis. So I'm doing that tomorrow night in rural Hungary at some and the village just decided to have a Scottish themed. And I want to find out why they're doing it. What was the origin? It's fascinating. So I have a couple more questions for you, but there's a question here. Please go ahead.
Yes.
Or just wait for the microphone here. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much, Dr. Nicholson and Max, for this very interesting conversation. My name is Miguel Toledano. I work in the European Parliament, and I come from Spain. And to me, your approach is very interesting. This cultural diplomacy is very, very interesting and important today. I would like to focus my question on what you mentioned about success and achievements that this mixture between cultural action and diplomacy can bring, especially nowadays. My country, I think, is strong in cultural action, but perhaps not so strong in cultural diplomacy. Perhaps in the past, France was strong in cultural diplomacy. Everybody liked Paris in the 19th century, the literature, the language, and so on. Would you be interested in continuing your research on achievements, concrete achievements that Hungary can bring to the world in terms of diplomacy, in terms of success to avoid wars, to avoid conflict, to de-escalate conflict, as you said, thanks to culture?
It's an interesting question. Max?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that to kind of start with my response to your question would be, I think you're right about this difference between cultural diplomacy and cultural action. They are categorically different in the sense that today we seem to have, in a lot of different ways, forgot the importance of the symbolic in diplomatic activities. You know, there is this kind of change that's happened since the end of the Cold War, and people have stopped differentiating themselves by their cultural identity and more so as a part of a system in some ways. But to kind of reiterate this point, I think that a perfect example would be when you have, for example, Ursula von der Leyen and Antonio Costa, I believe he was there, but these European leaders being brought to China and then being put onto a shuttle bus and being brought out, not meeting, the leader of China, Xi Jinping, but meeting a kind of lower ranking person. And you see in this display that it is kind of a rupture from what you would normally expect is if you are a serious leader or you are a head of state that you'll be meted by someone of equal ranking. But that's not what took place in that one case study, and that is partially because they say that the West has typically focused more on lecturing and telling others what to do than it has actually been on acting itself. And so it's in that sense, I think, lack of action and more so demanding things of others is a problem. I think cultural diplomacy is the way that countries ought to act, and it is the way that countries used to act. And so it is kind of a matter of returning to this more normal element of international engagement. And I think the successes that Hungary has seen in that are demonstrable in the way it is treated by its neighbours. Close relations with Slovakia, and even when it comes to relations with countries with different political views, there's still a recognition that Hungary is a part of this shared history that Europe has, or when it comes to being an observer state on the Turkic Council, of the Organization of Turkic States, where Hungary, being a distant relative, has still managed to include itself in this organization that is seeking to grow in its power and its influence, and to develop those states in that region. So I hope that answers your question.
I mean, I got kind of a statement, but also a kind of a question for you, I suppose, which is that, in the last few decades, there has been a general sense in globalization that culture is being sort of flattened a little bit, that the interesting crinkly edges of our own cultures are being slightly sanded off. If you go to a British high street, it looks just like the high street everywhere else. The buildings that are being built until the 1940s or 50s essentially were distinct. That you walk around Brussels, you can tell the architecture, which feels like it's of here. Or in Zurich, I was in Zurich a couple of days ago, you can see when there's like a Swiss house, and then there's just the international sort of a monocrop of skyscrapers growing up like glass weeds through the local kind of buildings. And it seems to me that what we've seen in the last few decades is a kind of a standardization of things. But cultural diplomacy seems to be precisely arguing that there is value in difference. So there's value in specificity, in something that's organically local in a sense. But I'm wondering, is cultural diplomacy like a growing interest in it? I think, is it a counterweight to that sort of monocrop of culture, or what? I mean, what is its relationship to that standardization? Are people missing a sense of specificity? Because I think what you mentioned about technocratic leaders going abroad, they may represent a system, but do they represent a particular? Is it the same thing as a culture or a community? And maybe in China maybe they can respond to something that feels like a culture.
Yeah, I think that the kind of standardization, and I'd even say like sterilization, neutralization of difference is a kind of an impediment to cultural diplomacy. And this is particularly, I would say, it's not something new in the sense that you do have dominant media sources, and American film was that in the late 20th century, whereas today it is now social media, which has kind of taken on a life of its own. But at the same time, I do think that these kinds of cultural elements are unavoidable. They are just elements of the character of a country that any citizen of that nation would have some kind of an experience with, and it is about being more honest about that, and being more honest with your neighbors about these things. This idea that in order to have better relations between states, we need to be speaking the same kind of language, not in the sense of literal language, but in the sense of body language and kind of mannerisms, I think is probably wrong. I think that these differences between countries should be important, and they should be important because if you want to deal with another country, whether it's diplomatically or in an economic capacity, you need to understand who they are. That is a fundamental part of it.
So you're saying it's not about making everyone the same, it's about negotiating difference, in a sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Has anyone else got any questions? Oh, please go ahead, the lady in the front.
I have a projecting voice, that should be okay.
I can see it, yes.
Can I put it?
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I put it to you, you talk about the history of cultural diplomacy, and I get the impression you start with the end of the First World War.
Mm-hmm.
I would put it to you that the history is much, much deeper, and this is an Austrian speaking. Coming from the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy, there has always been the tradition of celebrating the diversity within a unified whole. And I think this is being carried forward now to the 21st century, and I feel it when I'm in Austria and I go across the border, I'm in Bratislava, there is this celebration of diversity within a very broad and proud sort of unified framework, and we were a world power at some stage, long ago.
Absolutely, and I think that's where it comes into the kind of changing terminology of these ideas. Like I noticed in writing my dissertation that considering that cultural diplomacy or public diplomacy really only became a popular word that is used to describe a concept in the last 25, 30 years, that there are alternative terms that kind of describe this, and I think the one that I see the most in early 20th century Ireland is the idea of cultural relations, and cultural relations is a mechanism for understanding, and that the importance of that understanding is in order to facilitate a diplomatic relationship. And for each state this might be different. For early independent Ireland it was fundamentally about legitimacy, but I recognise your point that this is something that goes back a very long time.
Because, sorry, just to clarify what I meant, because when you look back to the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy, they accepted different languages, they accepted different cultures within the unified sort of political structure. So for a very long time they had to negotiate the interchange and still accepted them or recognized they are within a unified framework.
Thank you. And there's a lady just in the third row. Go ahead.
My name is I'm from MCC Brussels. I work in Brussels. And I think 2/3 of my life I did cultural as a diplomacy in a way. I lived for 25 years in Scandinavia. And what interests me is whether you could tell us about some patterns of Hungarian cultural diplomacy in hostile environments. And I'll just tell you an example. I lived in Denmark, and Danish society is very one-sided, informed about Hungary, Hungarian mentality, Hungarian politics. And I worked together with the Hungarian embassy a lot in Copenhagen. And it was interesting what they choose to do as cultural diplomacy was not really somehow to downgrade the Hungarian specificity of it and present Hungary through its minorities. For example, the Jewish minority, and by highlighting the exceptional good situation of the Jewish minority in Hungary, of Germans, of the Slovaks. So it was in a way a bit also kind of funny that we were not allowed to speak about Hungarianness, pure Hungarianness, ethical Hungarianness in this environment, in the Scandinavian environment. So I know this part of it, but maybe you have some other ideas or stories.
Yeah, I think with the example that you give, I think it kind of harkens back to the idea of cultural diplomacy in operation, focusing on the points of interest for the country that an embassy or an institution is resident in. And so in Denmark, and Scandinavia in general, it makes sense that if there are elements of Hungarian society that these countries don't find appealing, that you would search for other elements that are of interest to these countries in a way that you can continue. And it is about demonstrating a part of a society to another country, and these parts may vary depending on the interests of the government in that country at any given time, or the kind of general societal perception of a country as well, or even just their experience or the extent to which they actually think of Hungary. In the case of Denmark or Sweden, it's all about tailoring these responses, and so I think that's the method behind the focus on minorities.
Thanks, Max. Any other questions? The lady at the back.
I have a question because I was fascinated by the second part of your name, a model for Europe. If you hear European diplomats from the European Union External Action Services, nowadays there is a talk about European cultural diplomacy, or rather external cultural diplomacy. What do you think? Who should formulate it? And should European cultural diplomacy also be a part of European foreign?
So should European...
So to say foreign affairs.
Yeah.
That's what we're fighting for.
So is the question there about whether whether foreign diplomacy of the European Union should have a sort of qualitative element, or whether it should be purely sort of technocratic. Is that kind of the question?
Well, it's a question maybe to Max. What do you think about European cultural diplomacy? How we are, as Europeans, should formulate and who should do that, just to present Europe or European culture outside of the borders?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as I've kind of said previously about these ideas of tailoring the ideas and the culture, the elements of your culture that you present to, to make sure that it's of interest to the party that you're speaking with, it would be to, if you have an EU liaison office in a country, look at the most important European countries that have deep historical ties to this nation, and you would try and find these elements of similarity. It is ultimately about that kind of similarity and difference. The similarities in the sense that it's something that you have common ground on, and difference in the sense that it's something that, though you may be divided on it, you may have different cultural practices, but it's still something that you can respect because you've come to understand the points of common ground that you do have. And so I think that when it comes to having like a European cultural diplomacy, it would just have to depend on the time, the place, the location. This is a tool ultimately, and so it is kind of dependent on all of these additional factors.
There's a question just at the back here.
Thank you. My name is Laura Kovac, and I'm working partially as an urban planner, but I'm also project manager and curator of the Hungarian Contemporary Architecture Center in Budapest. And my question, what I noticed for myself was that it's really great that you summarize the strengths of the Hungarian cultural diplomacy in your research paper, and I mostly agree with it. But I wanted to ask if there were any challenges and weaknesses that you identified of the Hungarian cultural diplomacy, how it could be further developed, and what kinds of innovation could be integrated maybe. And I'm asking this because, in my opinion, there are the Hungarian soft power is not using its whole potential, and there are some exact areas in my mind which I consider as a missed opportunity. One of them is the contemporary interpretation of the Hungarian culture and heritage, because I often see it in a very simplified way in the international context. I really like traditional folk music and folk dances, but it would be really nice to see a bit more complexity, which really represents the richness of the contemporary Hungarian culture. There are plenty of really successful Hungarian artists, musicians, painters, photographers whose work is based on Hungarian motifs and heritage, but they are not very often represented in Hungarian institutions around Europe. And the other thing is that I noticed that we don't often give enough visibility to those Hungarians who gained a huge recognition and success on the international level. Just to mention two very fresh examples, the great writer László Krasznahorkai recently won the Nobel Prize, and then there is Tar Béla Tar. I wish rest him please. And he was basically one of the greatest filmmakers in the world, and I saw that here in the Liszt Institute they are also organizing a screening which is of Széten Tango, which is really nice, but I would expect something bigger, than this, because it would really engage a lot of international audiences, and yes, I just really don't see why these opportunities are missed to represent Hungarian culture.
Thanks, Max.
Could you kind of
Summary?
Summary? Yeah, because
well, I mean, okay. So integration. What do you see as potential for? You talked about the Hungarian model integrating quite well, but is there further room for integration? Because her point was that she doesn't feel Hungarian cultural diplomacy has reached its full potential, and particular with emphasis on contemporary culture. Azaria, I don't think is particularly well known. I'm not saying it's necessarily the best example.
Just to add something, I met contemporary representation of artists who are using Hungarian heritage, specifically Hungarian
Oh,
heritage.
specifically, right, okay, not
Yeah,
just Hungarian, okay, sure.
heritage in a contemporary
Oh, I see,
context.
right, okay, yeah. And so contemporary artists of any description, it could be, painters or writers or musicians that are drawing on tropes and frames of reference that are intrinsically Hungarian, but are contemporary, not simply Tanzhaus or something from, the past.
Yeah.
So, do you think it'd be further integration? Do you think it's reaching its full potential, and how could contemporary art or contemporary Hungarian culture be promoted better?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the real kind of focus would be scaling the ecosystem and the environment that already exists, and to kind of magnify and to add a focus onto these contemporary Hungarian artists. Now, how to do that? There are multiple ways that you can go about this. The typical ways that other countries have done it is kind of through embassies and through cultural attachés. And these are countries that don't have a system like Hungary of cultural institutes to represent the state, all under the same body. It's quite common that you have, with the Irish model, it is the Irish Cultural Centre in Paris is different from the Irish Cultural Centre in London, and that, they may have connections to the same entity, but they are comprised of different people, and so the leadership castes are kind of not divided, but they are just kind of separate in some ways. There's different levels to that, and so the way that typically works in the Irish model is these advertisement of books and contemporary literature, contemporary art, whether that's through inviting people to residencies like the ambassador's residence or to the embassy itself. There are ways of doing this. It is just a matter of scaling it, and kind of the point that I really want to reiterate here is for every country this might be different. There might be a Hungarian artist that is of more interest to Ireland. In fact, I was actually at a Bloomsday garden party at the Irish ambassador's residence in Budapest last year, and there was a speech given by a Hungarian author whose name I unfortunately forget, but he read an extract from his book, which was partially inspired by James Joyce's Ulysses, if I recall correctly. And so there is this kind of idea of, it really does depend on the country that you're dealing with. How deep is the connection that it has with Hungary? Is it in painting, arts, media? These are questions of scalability, and it's also fundamentally a question of interest. And I think that there is always some kind of interest, but it's just doing the due diligence to make sure that it is something that will be receptive. Yeah.
I just had a thought on this, though. I remember I'm British, and Britain's sort of cultural soft power is extensive, obviously, for a lot of interesting reasons, historical in particular. But there's always a sense in Britain that the best play has been written, which is probably true in our case, Shakespeare. But the best movie's been made, or the best everything's happened in the past. And my brother noted this. He says, the thing I hate about the UK, he says, whenever I come to the UK, is it's always the best is in the past. And he lives in Canada. He says, Canadians always think the best thing's in the future. And but I remember, though, in the late 90s, the government had this idea of cool Britannia. And there's nothing more cringe than when the government tries to say contemporary culture's cool. And it's so there is this interesting, because it's an interesting question, but there is always this challenge as soon as the state starts getting involved in trying to say, well, we're cool, the stuff we're doing now is great. There is the tendency to instantly it ceases to be, whereas the heritage is often something that if it's not sustained by public investment, if the museums are not maintained, then no one will maintain them because they're not strictly profitable. You just have to drum up interest in them. So there is an interesting paradox, I think, of the British context, that our country homes and so on in the UK, which is a great part of our heritage, wouldn't exist without the National Trust. And because they couldn't have maintained as homes. And so maybe there's a sense, and just thinking of the British example, the state has to intervene to preserve things that otherwise might simply decompose through time. And whereas contemporary culture, it's kind of like, if you're a, I don't want to be to run this analogy too far, but if you've got a family, the one thing that's going to crush a kid's creativity if their parent is coming in and trying to get involved in it. The kid's got to rebel a little bit, and I think it's natural for young people the people who are generating the culture, which typically, by the way, it tends to be. I mean, there's very few musicians in the popular culture who are writing a decent love song past 30. Probably because they've been too jaded at that point. But it's young people producing a lot of this stuff. But precisely those people should be, sort of rebelling against authority a little bit. And so the moment, I think in the UK, for instance, the government gets involved, I mean, as soon as Tony Blair was inviting Oasis to Downing Street for a drink, Oasis ceased to be pretty cool to the extent they only came back last year. So it's just my slightly flippant thought on that. I'm conscious of time, Jofi. How much time do we have?
We can have 2-3 more questions.
Sure, okay. Any more questions? Well, I have a couple for you, Max. If you put your hand up, and if you got any more. But so how long were you in Hungary last year?
3 months.
Okay, so Max,
3, 4,
context of Max, he showed up as an intern last summer, and I think had a pretty good time in Budapest for a few months, and then went back to Ireland. We've kept him on as a remote working intern, helping us with a number of things in the research department. And so you were there for a few months. And so here's a question for you. So went there, you were working on cultural diplomacy, you're an observant guy. What parallels did you see between Hungarian culture and Irish culture? And indeed, what differences? What stood out as that's very unusually similar, and that's definitely different?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I think that the kind of attitudes were very similar to things that I had noticed back home, and just in the kind of, when I was with my Hungarian friends, there's just something uncanny about it that you're kind of surprised, really. It's hard to kind of touch on, but there is some kind of similarity there. I think that kind of mentality as well may come from the history of being kind of a frontier culture. Ireland under the British Empire and Hungary with its unique language in the center of Europe. There is kind of an element of isolation that encourages difference and the differentiation of that. But in terms of differences, I think it's hard to put a pin into the differences, but it's the same kind of thing that you would find with other countries. Is you'd go over and you'd say, oh, this is very similar, and then by the time you've gone home, you realize, oh, actually, it's quite different.
And when you arrived, did anything just stand out? You think, oh, that's what did you notice? Did anything stand out particularly when you got there?
I'd say it is the material culture and the climate. The architecture, the climate, very different from my part of the world. And so
that's a good thing.
Yeah, it's a very good thing. Even in winter, it is actually very pleasant. So that was a big difference. Just to see and how that kind of encourages people to live certain ways. In Hungary, you actually have all 4 seasons. In Ireland, we kind of have 2 or 3.
I just want to mention one thing on this, and then we can, I think, wrap up for drinks unless anyone has another question. But I have this very distinctive memory from my first few months in Hungary, and I went to this festival. And at the festival, there was a dance house, dance houses. Dance houses, for those who aren't Hungarian, is there used to be folk dances across all of Europe in local villages. And under communism, there was some guy from Budapest who went out to these remote villages and he filmed these dances, brought the film back, trained dancers to dance these traditional country dances. And it became like a craze in Budapest to the extent it became a bit of a threat to the communist government, because it was people really celebrating being Hungarian through these dances. And as soon as they pushed it underground, it became really cool. And so it's still in the culture now. And it's got this strong this almost double heritage of the actual folk heritage, but also the fact it was an act of resistance, in a sense, under communism. And so I was at this festival, and there was a bunch of dance house people around. They weren't dancing at this point, they were drinking. And there was a guy on a violin playing a song. And all the Hungarians around were just listening to the music and singing and so on. And what was really interesting, I was looking at, I thought, what's strange about this? And I suddenly realized something. Not a single person had their camera out filming it. Everyone was part of it. They were not one step removed, consuming it as a cultural product. They were just part of the experience. There was no irony, there was no distance. And I thought, if this is in the UK, you'd have one violinist, one drunk guy singing, and 30 people filming it, or filming themselves, or filming each other filming it, in order to post it on social media to say, look, I'm having an authentic experience. And what was interesting here, no one wanted to record it to show everyone else they had an authentic experience. They were simply just doing it. And I thought, and as much as we talked before about contemporary culture and past culture, what I saw through that, and admittedly, it was a festival of people who were interested in folk music. There was a sense of, this wasn't ironic, it wasn't a performance of tradition, it simply was the culture. And for me as a Brit, it was nice to see a culture that was actually present in itself as opposed to one step removed. And I've really noticed that about Hungary. There's a lot of, it may be biased to the circles I spend time in, but it was a very notable difference. Any last words, Max?
No.
Nope? Okay. Well, thank you very much to all of you. Thank you very much for coming. And thank you to the Liszt Institute for inviting Danube across. We'll be back in a couple of months to do a next one with a different researcher who's done a very interesting paper. I haven't quite decided which one yet. We'll see who's in my good books then. And but yeah, please check out the Danube Institute website. We've got papers and events on there. Also, sign up for our Substack. We have a Substack called Based in Budapest, which is a very funny colleague of mine writes it. He's very witty. It's like a summary of what's happening in Budapest in general. Every Monday, it's worth signing up to. But right now, I believe there's some wine. So if we could just give a round of applause for Max. Thanks, Max.
Thank you.